He whispered her sister's name in bed and destroyed 3 years of marriage. Eleanor lay beside Alessandro Vitali, the most feared Mafia boss in Rome, believing she was finally the woman he loved. Then, in his sleep, he pulled her closer and breathed one word that shattered everything. Valentina, her sister's name, the woman he had loved before her. By sunrise, Elena was gone, leaving behind the silk sheets, the mansion, and the man who never realized he had just lost the only woman who truly stayed. Let us examine the clinical onset of trauma. The bedroom was entirely silent, illuminated only by moonlight cutting through expensive silk. Elena remained frozen, her skin exposed to the chilling air, trapped beneath the heavy arm of the man she thought loved her. Then came the trigger. He brushed her hair and whispered a name, Valentina, her own sister. The vocalization carried the unmistakable cadence of deep, obsessive longing. As a behavioral analyst, I see this exact moment of cognitive dissonance often. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply stared at the wall while the psychological scaffolding of her reality collapsed. Here is a truth. You and I must remember the deepest wounds in us life rarely bleed. They simply break us quietly from the inside out. 3 years of profound psychological submission. 3 years of living as a ghost in the shadow of a megalomaniac, desperately seeking validation. Alessandro had just shattered her delusion with a single, unconscious confession. She was never his prime fixation, merely a convenient substitute who stayed. Before we unpack the rest of this clinical study, take a moment to support this channel. Slipping into a state of acute dissociation, Elena moved through the dark room. She extracted herself from his grip with the silent precision of a captive. Her bare feet met the freezing marble. What she once called a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. Sometimes, the most meaningful lesson we can learn is that leaving is not a failure, but an act of profound self-preservation. The moonlight illuminated the dark ink crawling up his neck. Those Italian phrases were classic markers of antisocial pathology, declarations of dominance she had purposely ignored. His tattooed forearm rested exactly where her head had just been. These were the stamps of a man who thrived on absolute control and ruthless violence. In a textbook display of trauma bonding, she used to kiss those marks, tricking her brain into finding comfort in her captor. Now, she was entirely detached. She dressed herself in the shadows, her limbs functioning strictly on autopilot. We often mistake the gilded cages others build for us as love. Her closet was filled with expensive garments he had selected, systematically stripping away her autonomy, one designer dress at a time. The jewelry sitting on the velvet trays cost more than the house she grew up in. It was all physical evidence of a severe identity erasure. She left every single piece behind. On the vanity sat her plain leather purse, holding her original identification and a secret stash of cash. Subconsciously, the survival instinct in her hindbrain always knew she would need an escape route. She paused at the heavy wooden door, looking back at the sleeping kingpin. Without his conscious defenses active, Alessandro looked deceptively peaceful. His harsh, calculating features softened into an innocent mask. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. The face a monster wears while sleeping does not erase the damage he does when awake. He appeared capable of genuine human connection, just never with her. The memory of that whispered name looped relentlessly in her mind. Valentina, her older sister, the golden child who had dated this sociopath 3 years ago and possessed the sheer psychological fortitude to abandon him. Elena had walked into his trap 6 months later, building a classic dependency dynamic around a man who used her as a placeholder. She finally turned away from the bed. The corridor was lined with stolen art and heavy shadows. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but hypervigilance had taught her their exact movements. If you pay close enough attention to your surroundings, you can survive anything. She bypassed the security with ease, moving silently past the kitchen and slipping out into the manicured gardens toward the east gate. The eastern exit opened to an empty road, a literal pathway out of her clinical isolation. The frigid air struck her skin, yet she shed no tears. She was deep in the shock phase of trauma processing. The profound grief of recognizing she had fallen in love with a mirage would hit her later. For now, the repetitive motion of walking grounded her nervous system. She left behind the surveillance cameras of the facility she had foolishly called a home. Dawn was far off when she hit the highway. Back in the master bedroom, the narcissist finally woke. His hand swept across the mattress, expecting the familiar tactile feedback of his possession, only to find freezing silk. True peace begins the moment we finally stop trying to warm a cold heart. His pupils contracted against the harsh morning sunlight pouring into the room. He called her name. Silence was the only response. The kingpin sat up abruptly, his heavily tattooed arms bracing against the mattress as his brain registered an unexpected shift in his environment. The entire suite was devoid of her presence. No running water, no subtle scent of her floral perfume. A rare spike of adrenaline, perhaps an imitation of panic, hit his chest. You see, an obsessive controller cannot easily process the sudden removal of their subject. He tore through the bathroom, the closet, and the balcony. Her clothes and purse were missing, yet the trivial items, a hairbrush, a bottle of scent, a framed photograph of their illusion, sat perfectly undisturbed. His captive had vanished. Let us examine Alejandro in the exact moment his reality fractures. His phone displays 0 messages. The woman who functioned as his emotional anchor has vanished. He summons Marco, projecting the cold authority of an antisocial personality. "Where is Elena?" he demands. A micro-expression of unease flickers across the subordinate's face. Marco reports she simply walked out the east gate at 4 this morning. The concept of abandonment is incompatible with Alejandro's ego. The word left registers as severe cognitive dissonance. His respiration remains steady, ink shifting on his neck as his jaw clenches, a somatic manifestation of pure denial. Elena did not leave. The lesson here is simple. Absolute control is merely a fragile illusion we maintain to keep our deepest terrors at bay. In his mind, she was a permanent fixture, an object designed to fill the pathological void in his psyche. Find her, he orders. The command carries a lethal weight, triggering a survival reflex in his subordinate. When Marco hesitates, Alejandro's voice drops into a predatory register. Find her now. Left alone in the massive bedroom, the spatial dynamics suddenly shift, reflecting his internal isolation. His hands curl into fists, the tattoo stretching tight over white knuckles. He actively searches his memory banks for a behavioral trigger from the previous night. They had engaged in intimacy at a slow and tender pace. He recalls holding her against his chest, experiencing a rare instance of emotional regulation. He felt content, yet he missed the fundamental shift in her baseline behavior. You and I have seen this pattern before in clinical settings. The subconscious mind betrays the conscious facade. He assumed he had fallen asleep speaking Elena's name, but an intrusive thought fractures his certainty. The phone rings, interrupting his psychological unraveling. Marco reports that she boarded a train 2 hours ago, bound for Florence. Florence is the geographic epicenter of his trauma. It is where her sister, Valentina, resides. That specific name acts as a violent cognitive trigger. A fragmented dream resurfaces. He sees Valentina's face, hears her voice, remembers reaching for his former obsession. His autonomic nervous system freezes entirely. The horrific realization strikes him with the force of physical trauma. He had vocalized the sister's name in his sleep. He realizes she had been awake, lying beside him, processing the ultimate verbal betrayal. The psychological shock is so severe it disrupts his motor function, causing his knees to buckle. Marco's voice filters through the receiver, asking for permission to intercept the target. No, Alejandro replies, deciding to manage the crisis personally. He drops the device. For 3 years, he had utilized Elena as a stabilizing mechanism, benefiting from her warmth and extreme patience. Now a single subconscious slip has eradicated that foundation. He analyzes his own reflection in the vanity glass. He observes the cold ocular presentation, the rigid jawline, the physical modifications that brand him as an apex predator in the criminal underworld, a man desperate to project absolute dominance. His forearms bear the Italian word for family, a textbook display of compensation for early childhood abandonment. The knuckle tattoos advertise violence, a deterrent ensuring he rarely deploys physical force. He constructed a syndicate based entirely on environmental mastery, only to sabotage it during a REM cycle. Meanwhile, we observe the secondary subject, Elena, in transit. Seated in a train carriage, she stares at the landscape. Her reflection appears spectral, indicative of depersonalization. She exhibits zero-tear production. Her acute emotional shock has rapidly calcified into a rigid psychological armor, a classic defense mechanism. Her device has registered 17 incoming calls. The perpetrator's name illuminates the screen, demanding an attention she refuses to give. His auditory messages accumulate in her voicemail, which she erases without processing. His texts pile up like forensic evidence of emotional abuse, but she lacks the psychological stamina to litigate the damage. Please let me explain, he pleads, demanding to turn home. The concept of home is a fallacy for her, rooted in a disorganized attachment style. We must review their origin point. They interacted at a Milan gala 6 months after her sister terminated an engagement with him. Valentina, presenting strong narcissistic traits herself, discarded the kingpin without closure, stating simply that he was inadequate. Elena recognized her sister's pattern of treating human beings as disposable commodities. At that initial gala, she was entirely unaware of his true criminal identity. She failed to detect the predatory indicators beneath his tailored clothing, the latent hostility masked by discipline. Instead, she fixated on his trauma, misinterpreting a sociopathic void as wounded vulnerability. She developed a profound trauma bond, falling in love with his psychological fractures, a textbook case of a rescue fantasy that ultimately ruined her. The transport arrives at the Florence station under the late afternoon sun. Elena retrieves her single bag and steps onto the concrete platform. She operates purely on the fight or flight response. She possesses no strategic objective, only a biological imperative to establish distance from her captor. Her previous support systems are entirely eradicated. She returns to the origin of her trauma with absolutely nothing left. Let's look at this case file together. You and I are going to unpack the psychological wreckage of a megalomaniac narcissist. When Elena fled, there was only one person in Florence who might offer sanctuary, the very woman who unwittingly caused her trauma. Valentina's story opened her door to find her younger sister trembling in the hallway. Elena, she said, her voice carrying the genuine shock of someone facing a ghost. Can I stay? The question hung in the air, weighed down by years of complicated sibling rivalry. The older sister always took what she wanted, while the younger took whatever scraps were left. Valentina's expression shifted from surprise to a flash of deep guilt. Of course, she stepped aside. They always let the pain in. The apartment perfectly mirrored Valentina's internal state: modern, highly expensive, and completely stripped of warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Arno River, and abstract paintings broke up the stark white walls. It was a carefully curated, emotionally barren cage. Do you want to tell me what happened? Elena dropped her bag onto the leather sofa. He said, "Your name." The words dropped between them like an anvil. Valentina's entire body went rigid. What? Elena's voice fractured, the raw vocal distress of a broken attachment. Last night in bed. He was asleep and he said your name, Valentina, like a prayer. Absolute silence swallowed the room. All the color drained from the older sister's face. Valentina stood absolutely frozen near the window, the afternoon light catching the sharp, guarded angles of her face. She shared Elena's dark hair and brown eyes, but she had built a much thicker psychological armor. 3 years, Elena whispered, sounding completely detached from her own body. 3 years I gave him. I thought he loved me. I truly believed he had moved past whatever toxic bond you two shared, but he never did. I was just a substitute. A mere shadow of his primary obsession. I never meant for this to happen. Valentina whispered back, her voice barely working. Elena looked closely at her sister and spotted a micro-expression she rarely saw. Genuine, primal fear. What really happened between you two? Why did you leave him? Valentina physically turned away, wrapping her arms around her chest in a classic self-soothing gesture. It is complicated. Elena shot back that after 3 years of being an unwitting surrogate, she had earned the right to complicate it. A heavy, suffocating pause filled the room. I didn't leave him. Valentina's voice trembled, her rigid control finally cracking. He sent me away. Elena's mind simply refused to process the statement. The kingpin sent her away for her own protection, claiming a threat he couldn't handle without risking her life. He ordered her to run. Valentina turned back, her eyes shining with tears. He had coldly told her he felt nothing for her. I believed his lies, she laughed bitterly. So I left. I spent months actively hating him, and then years desperately trying to forget him. When I heard he had taken you in, I assumed he had finally moved on. She shook her head slowly. I was jealous, Elena, so violently jealous it clouded my judgment. But it also made me think I was wrong, that maybe he truly never cared for me. You and I have seen this cognitive dissonance before. Elena's mind raced, retroactively analyzing 3 years of psychological data. Alessandro's emotional distance, his rigid behavioral control, the way he sometimes looked at her with an undeniable flash of guilt. Was it all a fabricated performance? Had she been nothing more than a living shield for his true obsession? Why didn't you tell me? Elena's voice broke. Why didn't you warn me about the trap? Valentina immediately went on the defensive. What was I supposed to say? Do not fall for him. He might still be pathologically obsessed with me. Her laugh was hollow, entirely devoid of joy. You were so happy. For the first time since our mother passed, you actually had light in your eyes. I couldn't destroy that. Elena processed the betrayal. So, instead, you let me build an entire life on a foundation of lies. Valentina pleaded that she thought the shift was genuine. He whispered your name in his sleep, Elena yelled, the volume of her voice tearing through the quiet apartment. Does that sound like a man who moved on? Valentina had no defense. The sisters stood in a bitter standoff. 3 years of repressed secrets hung suspended in the heavy air between them. "What are you going to do now?" Valentina finally asked. Elena looked down at her bare hands. She had stripped away every piece of jewelry, leaving no rings or bracelets, zero physical proof that she had ever belonged to him. "I don't know." Admitting that out loud caused more psychological distress than the actual betrayal. She was suffering from classic Stockholm syndrome. Without her captor, she didn't know who she was. The Kingpin's surveillance team located her within 48 hours. He didn't order an immediate extraction. He simply needed a continuous feed of data where she slept, what she ate, keeping her safe from his enemies. Reports arrived every 6 hours. Stick with me, this is where the predator's mind begins to fracture. The field reports came in steadily. She was staying with her sister, buying only basic necessities, visiting a quiet cafe near the Ponte Vecchio, no contact with anyone else. The Kingpin read every single update in his study, completely surrounded by a massive criminal empire that suddenly felt entirely worthless. The mansion was hollow. The bed was freezing. Marco watched his boss unravel with mounting alarm. "You need to sleep," he urged on the 3rd day. "You need to eat." Alessandro's voice was raw, stripped of his usual sociopathic control. "I need her back." Marco told him to just go get her. When has anyone's consent ever stopped Alessandro Vitali? The megalomaniac narcissist stood paralyzed by the window, staring blankly at the gardens Elena had personally designed. Every single flower, every winding path, every water feature, they were her desperate attempts to inject some beauty into his violent, deeply disturbed world. "This is different," he said quietly. "Why?" Because he recognized the catastrophic psychological damage he had done. He had taken her heart and completely crushed it under the weight of another woman's memory. He gave her nothing but calculated lies. She deserves better than force. Marco was stunned into silence. In 15 years, he had never heard his boss factor in a victim's worth. Alessandro took what he wanted, but right now he was actively mourning. Alessandro wasn't just missing Elena. He was exhibiting the textbook symptoms of profound grief. 1 week slowly bled into 2. Elena, meanwhile, established a rigid new behavioral loop in Florence. Coffee at the same cafe every morning. A long walk along the river every afternoon. Evenings spent in suffocating, tense silence with her sister. They actively avoided talking about the past. They existed on parallel tracks. 2 women deeply scarred by the exact same psychological stressor. Elena knew she was being monitored. His operatives were highly trained. But 3 years with a hyper-vigilant mob boss had sharpened her own survival instincts. She caught their reflections in windows and noticed the strangers who refused to make eye contact. The king knew her exact coordinates, yet he maintained a strictly calculated distance. We are about to uncover the core of her trauma bond right here. This passive behavior created a maddening cognitive dissonance in Elena's brain. The traumatized part of her actually wanted him to storm into Florence and make violent demands to prove he was the controlling monster her logic told her he was. It is always easier to hate the villain when they act like one, but he never came. He just watched. "You need to decide on a course of action," Valentina pressed one evening over wine. "You can't live in this limbo forever." Elena wanted to fight back, but her sister was right. She had merely traded one psychological cage for another. "What would you do?" Elena asked quietly. Elena stared out at the dark river for a long time. "I would talk to him." Why? Because Valentina had accepted her in exile without demanding the truth. She had spent years running mental simulations of conversations that never happened. You have questions. He holds the answers. You will never heal until you face the source of your trauma. Elena argued that a narcissist would only feed her more lies. Valentina offered a sad, knowing smile. But at least you'll know you tried. You'll finally have closure. Closure, such a neat, clinical word for such a massive emotional wreckage. Elena stared at the sky, wondering if she possessed the mental fortitude to face her former captor. He finally broke his holding pattern on the 15th day. Elena was sitting at her usual cafe, staring blankly at an unread book, when the harsh scrape of a chair shattered her focus. She looked up and found herself staring straight into the face of Alessandro Vitali. Let's look closely at his physical deterioration. Severe dark circles bruised his eyes. His cheekbones jutted out sharply under a rough, unshaven jaw. Even his dark suit, usually an immaculate piece of armor, hung off him in rumpled disarray. But his tattoos, those permanent markers of his violent pathology, were fully exposed. The ink crawled up his neck and marked his knuckles. Elena. He breathed her name like a dying man. I didn't want to talk to you, she said. I know you blocked my calls, he swallowed hard, a rare display of autonomic distress. But I needed to see you. I need to explain. Elena kept her vocal tone perfectly flat, masking the violent pounding of her heart. Explain what? Rationalize why you've been dreaming of my sister. Explain why this was built on clinical deception. The kingpin played his final card. I love you. The words sliced through her psychological defenses. She scanned his face for the cold manipulation expected from a megalomaniac narcissist, finding only raw desperation. You don't, she replied softly. You love her. Here is the truth about trauma. The hardest but most necessary step in healing is realizing you cannot fix someone else's broken heart. You must protect your own. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file together. We start with Alessandro, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist, sitting in a crowded Florence cafe. He tells Elena that he sent his former lover away to protect her from his violent world. Elena, displaying the early cognitive dissonance of Stockholm Syndrome, accuses him of using her as a mere replacement. The criminal kingpin actually flinches. The surrounding tourists are entirely blind to the psychological devastation at that corner table. His tattooed hands clench as he confesses his initial pathology. He admits he thought she was a ghost, mirroring his lost obsession in looks and movement. He stares at her with a manipulative, bleeding vulnerability, confessing he used her to fill an emotional void. The subject rationalizes his parasitic attachment, claiming it began as mere convenience before evolving into reality. His voice cracks, a calculated emotional display from a man incapable of true vulnerability. He calls himself a coward, a classic manipulative tactic designed to elicit sympathy. Elena's reaction is textbook trauma bonding. Her psychological conditioning urges her to absorb his words, desperate to let her captor heal the very wounds he inflicted. Yet, her survival instinct resists. She reminds him of the ultimate betrayal, the moment he called out the other woman's name while holding her. Alessandro deflects, blaming his subconscious, claiming he was simply reliving the traumatic loss of his past. The heavy silence that follows confirms her deepest fears. The undeniable pathology sits between them like a physical object. Alessandro blames his subconscious, separating his waking mind from his nocturnal guilt in a classic dissociative split. He insists he knows who he reaches for in the morning, claiming her 2-week absence has completely destroyed him. Notice his physical restraint here. He reaches across the table but stops just short of physical contact, a brilliant demonstration of coercive control masquerading as respect. He declares his love. Elena stares at his ink-stained fingers, analyzing the sudden shift. For 36 months, this apex predator had dictated every variable of her existence. He is a narcissist who operates with absolute authority, effortlessly bending the reality of everyone in his orbit to suit his needs. Yet now, the kingpin presents himself as a broken, desperate man in a public setting. It is the ultimate psychological masquerade. Elena, struggling to break the trauma bond, states that she needs time. We see a micro-expression in his eyes, a flicker of relief that his subject has not entirely severed the tether. She articulates a profound crisis of identity, a common symptom of prolonged psychological subjugation. She literally does not know if a version of herself exists outside his narcissistic shadow. When he promises to wait forever, the absolute certainty in his tone triggers a psychosomatic ache in her chest. She stands and avoids his gaze to protect her fragile autonomy. She issues a desperate boundary, demanding he withdraw his surveillance and his men. Let us pause and examine this crucial phase of separation. She delivers an ultimatum demanding space as proof of his affection. She walks away without looking back. Though her hypervigilance remains fully active, she can physically feel his predatory gaze tracking her movements through the Florence crowd, an internalized surveillance that victims of extreme control often report. Surprisingly, the megalomaniac complies, withdrawing his men that very night. It takes her 3 full days to register the absence of his surveillance apparatus. The phantom watchers in shop windows vanish. The operatives with earpieces on street corners disappear. There is no longer any empirical evidence that Alessandro Vitali is monitoring her respiration and daily behavioral patterns. This is where the pathology of Stockholm Syndrome becomes profoundly visible. The removal of her captor's observation should induce a sense of liberty. But instead, it triggers acute abandonment anxiety. She experiences intense cognitive dissonance, despising herself for this contradictory emotional response. The withdrawal of his control mechanisms leaves her feeling entirely unmoored, rather than empowered. When her associate Valentina points out that the surveillance has ceased, Elena cannot even validate the relief. She is reduced to wandering the city like a hollow shell, attempting to reconstruct a personality she systematically dismantled for Alessandro over 3 years. She paces through childhood streets and museums, desperately hunting for her pre-trauma identity. The original version of herself is completely inaccessible. 36 months of adapting to a narcissist's rigid environment will effectively overwrite a victim's neural pathways. She suffers from profound identity paralysis, unable to determine basic dietary preferences, geographical desires, or long-term life goals. She has functioned solely as a mirror for his ego, and a mirror possesses no independent existence in the dark. Then, the external environmental variables shift violently. During a routine morning walk, a black sedan intercepts her path. An unidentified operative with a distinctly psychopathic affect smiles from the rolled-down window, requesting a conversation. The threat detection protocols Alessandro instilled within her immediately trigger a massive adrenaline spike. She attempts evasive action, but the vehicle maintains its trajectory. The operative drops the polite facade, confirming the predatory nature of the encounter. Elena pivots toward a high-density pedestrian zone, her sympathetic nervous system engaging a full fight-or-flight response. The vehicle is obstructed by barriers, but an assailant seizes her arm from behind. The physical contact is forceful. They demand intelligence regarding Alessandro Vitali. In behavioral terms, Elena's theoretical understanding of risk suddenly collides with harsh reality. She had intellectually comprehended that shedding her captor's armor increased her vulnerability to rival syndicates. Yet, her conditioned belief in Alessandro's omnipotence had tricked her into a false sense of absolute immunity. Stick with me here, because her defense mechanisms are fascinating. She attempts to use her separation as a shield, stating they are no longer affiliated. The assailant's smile demonstrates high dark triad traits, noting that her isolation makes her the optimal target. He offers the illusion of a civilized surrender. Elena scans the environment, experiencing the stark reality of the bystander effect. The civilian population actively ignores the unfolding trauma. For 3 years, she is inside the kingpin's impenetrable psychological terrarium. That invisible armor had normalized her existence. Now, stripped of his protective terror, rival predators have closed in. She threatens to vocalize her distress, but the operative calculates the slow behavioral response time of the crowd. The operative uses social psychology against her, weaponizing the public's tendency to ignore perceived domestic conflicts. He applies kinetic force, dragging her toward extraction. Elena's prefrontal cortex rapidly computes her diminishing variables. Physical resistance is mathematically unviable against his mass. Auditory alarms would fail to penetrate the crowd's apathy before extraction. Then, the situation resolves with lethal ballistic efficiency. A suppressed projectile terminates the assailant's central nervous system. He collapses instantly, dropping her. The extraction vehicle aborts the mission, burning rubber in a panicked retreat. Elena is paralyzed by acute auditory exclusion and shock. Then, Alessandro's primary enforcer, Marco, physically secures her with calculated gentleness. Marco issues a mandatory command for immediate relocation. Elena's vocal cords tremor as she points out the inconsistency in Alessandro's promise to cease surveillance. Marco navigates her toward a secondary extraction vehicle, admitting that while the kingpin stopped his observation, his subordinates did not. Elena exhibits severe neurogenic tremors, the physiological aftermath of a disrupted kidnapping. She questions their motive. Marco's response highlights the systemic codependency within criminal hierarchies. Subordinates anticipate the narcissist's desires despite his directives. As the vehicle departs, Elena observes her shaking hands. She must integrate a difficult cognitive reality. Her captor's syndicate remains her only defense against external annihilation. She is transported away. The destination is deliberately devoid of the kingpin's physical presence. It is a fortified villa, populated by silent guards, projecting an aura of clinical respect. Marco delivers a fascinating psychological contradiction. He assures her she is not a captive, yet highly recommends she remain confined until hostile variables are eliminated. When she interrogates him about the assailants, Marco confirms they are rival cartel elements seeking a tactical advantage against the narcissistic patriarch. Her bid for autonomy was immediately calculated by hostile actors as a systemic vulnerability. Elena collapses onto the leather furniture, experiencing sudden motor function failure. The tragic irony of her psychological condition is clear. She pursued independent agency only to end up back in his grip. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Instead of achieving self-actualization, she became a mere instrument of psychological warfare against the man she fled. She asks if Alessandro has been briefed on the kinetic event. Marco's hesitation indicates the volatile state of the Kingpin's emotional regulation. He confirms Alessandro was intercepted en route to the airport. Marco used de-escalation tactics, reminding the narcissist of Elena's strict boundary regarding physical proximity. The enforcer notes that overriding his predatory instinct to hoard is a monumental deviation from his usual behavioral baseline. Elena closes her eyes, absorbing this data. In the twisted framework of a megalomaniac, denying his own obsessive compulsion to control her is the highest metric of affection. For a pathology built on domination, granting physical absence during a crisis is an excruciating cognitive burden. Elena swallows her residual panic and says to tell him thank you. This single phrase reinforces the trauma bond, validating the captor's methodology. Over a 4-day observation period, Marco manages her environment with strict professional detachment. He categorizes her as an asset rather than the emotional catalyst for his superior's instability. The rival syndicate had correctly diagnosed her departure as a weakness. On the final day, Marco announces the threat is neutralized through a kinetic message. His cold silence confirms lethal retaliation. It proves a simple, meaningful lesson. True freedom is not just walking away, it is breaking the mental chains they leave behind. Let's open this clinical file together and observe our subject, Elena. 3 years submerged in the violent environment of a megalomaniac narcissist like Alessandro had conditioned her to avoid asking questions. Survival in captivity often requires a deliberate, selective blindness, yet she found her mind compulsively returning to his image in that cafe, fractured, desperate, stripped entirely of his pathological control. When he withdrew his surveillance at her request, acting against his most primal possessive instincts, it created a profound cognitive dissonance. He was staying away, despite the active threat to her life, merely because she had demanded it. From a psychiatric standpoint, he was attempting to overwrite his own hardwired pathology just for her. It shows us that even the darkest minds can sometimes bend. The clinical question remained, could this behavioral shift sustain itself? By the 5th day of isolation, Elena initiated contact. His subordinate, Marco, exhibited visible relief before making the call. Alessandro's arrival was telegraphed by auditory triggers, tires tearing through gravel, heavy car doors slamming shut, frantic footsteps on stone. Elena waited in the safe house, experiencing acute physiological arousal, her pulse spiking. When the door finally gave way, the physical deterioration of the subject was staggering. His suit hung off a frame, suffering from rapid weight loss, his face shadowed by untamed stubble. Yet, his pupils dilated aggressively upon acquiring his target. The life lesson here is simple. Severe obsession consumes the host just as completely as it consumes the victim. When he spoke her name, the sound triggered a deep trauma bond response within Elena. They stood paralyzed on opposite ends of the room, the space thick with repressed psychological tension. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone unnervingly flat. She confirmed his guard had intervened in time. His jaw locked, a manifestation of his internal loss of control. He confessed his compulsion to reach her, his voice fracturing as he admitted his absolute terror of losing her to rival predators. He began a systematic self-flagellation, taking total responsibility for the danger. Loving her, releasing her, he categorized all of it as his own failure. We see this often in criminal analysis. A controller will claim guilt simply to maintain the absolute illusion that they dictate every possible outcome. He listed his failures until she commanded him to stop. Notice how he immediately complied, a rare behavioral submission for a megalomaniac narcissist. Elena closed the physical gap, evaluating the desperate hope radiating from his expression. She rationally outlined her psychological barriers, the chronic inability to trust him, and the persistent paranoia that she was merely a substitute for another woman. Yet, the Stockholm Syndrome had fully taken root. She admitted she could no longer sustain the facade of evasion, confessing she was completely consumed by thoughts of him. He visibly reacted as she plainly stated the severe emotional damage he had inflicted. It is a harsh reality of human nature. Attachment built on a foundation of terror always leaves a permanent scar. She articulated her trauma clearly, acknowledging the psychological damage he had caused. Yet, she revealed a classic trauma bonding symptom. During her abduction, her mind localized entirely on him. Her primary distress was not the threat of death, but the unresolved conflict of their final interaction. She offered a compromise, not absolution, but the construction of a new, transparent dynamic. At this, his motor control faltered. His hand trembled as he touched her face. He offered total verbal compliance, promising to declassify his history with Valentina, his night terrors, and his most grotesque secrets. He offered the very truths that could trigger her escape. We must understand this dark reality. When an apex predator voluntarily exposes their own throat, it is often the ultimate manipulation of trust. He proposed a complete psychological unmasking, accepting the risk of rejection so she could accurately perceive his core identity. He engaged in soothing tactile behavior, tracing her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted his history of extreme violence. When she prompted him to quantify her worth, his focus locked onto hers, devoid of defensive hostility. He stated unequivocally that her value superseded his criminal empire, his capital, and his generational lineage. He outlined a willingness to systematically destroy his own syndicate for her. Before he could finish his destructive ideation, she initiated a kiss. Their verbal negotiation collapsed into a primitive, frantic biological response. It teaches us a vital lesson. Logical reasoning rarely survives a direct collision with desperate human craving. His response was immediate and constricting. He restrained her against his body with desperate tension, displaying the severe separation anxiety of a broken attachment type. Upon breaking the connection, both exhibited elevated respiratory rates. He issued a directive disguised as a plea. "Come home." Her refusal triggered an immediate somatic stiffening. She rationally articulated a need for psychological isolation to re-establish her individual identity outside his pathological sphere. When he demanded a timeline, she refused to provide one. You and I can clearly see the violent internal conflict playing out on his face. Every hardwired instinct demanded he override her autonomy and forcefully extract her to Rome. Ultimately, true power is simply knowing when to release your grip. In a massive behavioral deviation, he submitted to her terms. He agreed to wait, though he flatly refused to terminate his surveillance, citing the threat of the rival cartel. Rather than rejecting this, she negotiated for transparency, demanding a cognitive role in her own security apparatus. He conceded. He then established his own requirement for constant verbal reinforcement, requesting daily communication to verify her existence. This mutual exchange of temporal mechanisms effectively deactivated her chronic physiological stress response, the knot of fear she had carried since her initial escape. They verbally committed to a collaborative partnership. The subsequent 30 days would serve as the ultimate clinical trial. Real healing always demands uncomfortable, persistent compromise, re-established her base in Florence. She maintained daily auditory contact with the subject, exchanging mundane civilian observations alongside deep psychological unearthings. He finally provided the unredacted file on Valentina. He detailed the initial infatuation, admitting he miscalculated her resilience for his violent underworld. The catalyst for their fracture was a direct assassination threat. He recounted this trauma with a terrifyingly flat, effective defense mechanism masking severe guilt. Rivals intended to execute her simply to shatter his reputation as an apex protector. We observe the central pathology of the megalomaniac narcissist here. They view the destruction of a loved one primarily as a direct attack on their own ego. His tactical solution was brutal psychological warfare directed at his partner. By systematically destroying her affection, he neutralized her strategic value to his enemies. His respiratory distress indicated the profound damage this maneuver inflicted on his own psyche. Then, Elena entered the matrix. Her extreme physical resemblance to the discarded partner triggered a cognitive break. He rationalized his possession of Elena as instrumental use, a classic deflection tactic to avoid processing his vulnerability. He confessed his attachment had mutated. Elena ceased to be a psychological stand-in and forged an independent neural pathway in his brain. Sometimes, the elaborate lies we tell ourselves are merely heavy shields against the terrifying vulnerability of starting over. Interrogated his subconscious activity, questioning the persistent dreams of his former partner. His clinical diagnosis was immediate: acute guilt. He engineered a scenario where a human being felt fundamentally worthless, a burden he could not metabolize even after transferring his fixation to Elena. However, his subconscious mapping finally updated. His sleep cycle was now exclusively populated by Elena, her face, her voice, her agonizing absence. She processed this confession, recognizing that her trauma lacerations were slowly beginning to coagulate, even if complete regeneration was impossible. 2 months post-extraction, she re-entered Rome. Crucially, she secured a neutral apartment. True independence is the only viable armor when negotiating a life with an apex predator. Let's analyze his adaptation phase. The subject displayed unprecedented behavioral plasticity. He adhered strictly to her access parameters, entering her territory only upon invitation and retreating when she required isolation. He participated in civilian rituals, traversing public spaces without the sterile barrier of armored vehicles. He was actively rewiring his dominance, learning to occupy her environment rather than forcing her assimilation into his. During a walk along the Tiber, she diagnosed his discomfort with being exposed in an open environment. He confirmed his severe aversion to the operational risk, yet validated his motivation. The physical risk was an acceptable currency to secure her presence. True psychological growth always requires us to step out from behind our armored glass. The gang insignia on his knuckles remained a permanent marker of a predator. However, cognitive reframing altered their psychological weight. They were no longer threat indicators. They were an archived history of violence Elena was integrating into her narrative. The ultimate clinical stress test initiated shortly after. Elena orchestrated a controlled environment to re-engage with Valentina, aiming to repair their severed bonds. Upon entering the perimeter, Valentina exhibited an acute freeze response. Alessandro was positioned in a possessive stance, his hand anchoring Elena's back, radiating lethal authority despite his civilian camouflage. Elena took command, confirming she engineered this tripartite confrontation Confronting the past directly is the only way to neutralize its radioactive power. The debriefing was a masterpiece of psychological tension. Alessandro dismantled the fabricated narrative he had constructed. As he detailed the tactical necessity of his rejection, Valentina's emotional dam failed. Years of resentment dissolved. She vocalized her core trauma, the manufactured belief of her inadequacy. Alessandro offered zero defensive posturing. He diagnosed his own cowardice, admitting his actions were designed to shield his ego from the trauma of her potential murder, not to ensure her survival. When Valentina cross-examined him regarding Elena's initial utility, his response was clinically brutal. He admitted Elena's physical similarity was her only original function. The lesson here is chilling. A narcissist will always seek a mirror, no matter who stands behind the glass. Let us open this file and examine the pathology together. We often mistake the easing of psychological pain for the presence of true affection. For Elena, the trauma bonded her to her captor. Valentina, the discarded sister, sat across from the narcissist, Alessandro. She claimed she no longer hated him, rationalizing her abuse. She turned to Elena, insisting he loved her. Noting the obsessive gaze he never gave her, Valentina smiled, a textbook trauma response, claiming she had 3 years to heal. She even minimized her own worth, calling herself a mere stepping stone in their twisted dynamic. It is a chilling display of collateral damage. People will rewrite their own history just to survive the present. Valentina exhaled, offering a disturbing absolution. She expressed gladness that Elena had found a man who viewed her as the center of the universe, entirely missing that a narcissist only sees a mirror, not a person. Elena, desperate for normalcy, reached out to mend their fractured sibling bond. That very night, Alessandro brought his primary supply back to the estate. Returning a victim to the site of their subjugation is a calculated move. The gardens she had cultivated for 3 years lay untouched in the silver moonlight, the fountain bubbling in the dark. It is a tragic human flaw. We often return to the cages that held us, mistaking the familiar bars for a place of safety and belonging. Alessandro claimed he had changed nothing, framing his obsessive preservation as romance. He told her it would feel like erasing her. This is classic megalomania. He controlled the environment to control the memory. Elena wandered the paths, touching the petals, confessing to moments of happiness, even while drowning in his shadow. This cognitive dissonance is the hallmark of Stockholm Syndrome. She turned to study him. He sensed me. He stood at the perimeter, a predator wrapped in a dark suit. The moonlight caught the violent ink on his neck and knuckles. He was the architect of her destruction, now masquerading as her savior. It teaches us a grim reality. The hand that breaks you can never truly be the hand that heals you. She admitted her confusion, a sign of her fractured psyche. He approached, his hands taking her waist with an ownership that disguised itself as affection. He offered her infinite time, projecting the illusion of free will. When she tested the boundary, asking if she could truly leave, his physical reaction, a tight jaw, betrayed his words. He promised to let her go, weaponizing his past abuse of Valentina to appear reformed. He pressed his forehead to hers, utilizing the ultimate narcissistic script. He claimed she had cured his monstrous nature, that she alone made him feel. This places an impossible burden on the victim.
We must remember,
true change comes from within, not from burdening another soul. Stick with me here, because this is where the behavioral pattern seals itself. He whispered that he only wanted her, and she kissed him. It was not forgiveness, but a deep physiological submission. When she looked into his eyes, She saw what she interpreted as love, though a clinician would recognize it as predatory possessiveness. Elena laid down her terms, attempting to reclaim agency. She demanded her own space, insisting she would not vanish into his shadow, threatening to leave if he kept secrets. He agreed flawlessly. She searched his face for deception and found none, because a true psychopath believes his own lies in the moment. It is a fatal error to mistake a smooth mask for a genuine face. He pulled her against his chest, his heart accelerating. This physiological response is not romance, it is the adrenaline spike of a predator resecuring his primary supply. He murmured his gratitude into her hair. She held him in the very garden that had hosted her psychological dismantling. The weeks that followed entered the classic honeymoon phase of the abuse cycle. It was a highly calibrated behavioral dance. Elena moved into a separate wing of the estate, decorating it to her own taste in a desperate bid to maintain a fragmented sense of self. She kept her city apartment as a theoretical escape hatch, but safety nets are useless if you have already surrendered your mind to the man holding the ropes. Alessandro maintained a calculated distance. He did not push her boundaries, joining her for meals only when invited, and sharing her bed strictly on her terms. From a clinical perspective, this is a masterful display of delayed gratification by a megalomaniac. Elena observed the visible effort it took for him to restrain his dominance. She watched the king pretend to kneel, and, in her trauma-bonded state, she interpreted this manipulation as profound love. The affection she harbored was deeply entangled with the trauma of never being truly seen by him. She was falling for his restraint, failing to realize that a monster holding its breath is still a monster. Restraint is not the same thing as rehabilitation. Watching him suppress his violent impulses, Elena felt a tragic sense of permanence taking root. 3 months into this behavioral experiment, Alessandro paraded her at a high society charity gala. This was a strategic public relations maneuver. Her previous escape had inflicted a severe narcissistic injury upon him, spawning rumors that undermined his absolute authority. By placing her on his arm, he was neutralizing the threat to his ego. He dressed her in a custom dark blue gown. She was not a partner. She was a meticulously curated prop designed to project stability. It is a sobering lesson in criminal dynamics. When a powerful man puts you on a pedestal, it is usually just to improve his own lighting. His gaze functioned as a spotlight, validating her existence through his approval. When she noted the staring crowds, his hand asserted ownership at the base of her spine. He navigated the room, relying on the ambient fear the Vitali name commanded. Tonight, he had physically concealed true nature. A high collar and gloves masked the gang tattoos that mapped his violent history. Elena, fully submerged in her Stockholm syndrome, felt her heart ache at this deception. She touched his gloved hand, whispering that he did not need to hide his ink for her. By accepting the visual markers of his criminality, she was integrating his darkness into her own identity. We absorb the toxicity we refuse to reject. You and I must pause to examine this exact moment of total psychological surrender. She declared she loved even the parts of him that terrified her. This is the ultimate victory. For a megalomaniac, unconditional acceptance of his pathology. A simulated vulnerability washed over his face as he pulled her onto the dance floor. Their movements were dictated by deeply ingrained muscle memory, a physical metaphor for their toxic cycle. He held her close, his breathing regulated, calculating his next escalation. He whispered that he had a question, reaching into his jacket. Her autonomic nervous system stalled. He spoke of the past, rewriting his abusive discard of her sister as an act of misguided protection. His pitch remained intimately low. He opened a velvet box to reveal a precisely calibrated piece of jewelry, a diamond haloed by sapphires. It was a psychological tool designed to appear perfect without triggering her anxiety. He uttered the proposal, isolating her completely within a crowded room. Then came the masterstroke of manipulative dialogue. He claimed he did not deserve her, feigning remorse for his past. He stated he loved her more than power or control. For a criminal kingpin, this is the ultimate lie. Power is their only oxygen. He was offering a permanent contract disguised as a romantic gesture. A promise from a predator is never a vow of devotion. It is simply a change in your security classification. In her mind, she was rewriting his history. 3 years ago, she had analyzed him as a broken man, incapable of emotion, accepting his crumbs of affection. Now, her fractured psyche convinced her this was a reformed man. She believed he had unlearned his need for absolute dominance. When she breathed her immediate consent, she sealed her own fate. His features shifted, adopting a mask of boyish vulnerability to reward her compliance. He slid the metal band onto her finger, physically tagging his property in front of his peers. The surrounding whispers meant nothing to her insulated reality. We see this in maximum security wards all the time. The captive eventually stops looking for the exit and starts polishing the locks. Her future was now entirely dictated by his pathology. They married within 30 days, a rapid timeline typical of a narcissist securing their asset before reality can intervene. The ceremony was hidden away in the very garden of her previous confinement. Only his enforcer, her discarded sister, and a complicit priest stood as witnesses. Elena wore pure white silk, the aesthetic of innocence, while Alessandro wore pitch black, his violent tattoos fully exposed at her own misguided request. She had romanticized the markings of a killer. He recited the vows with a perfectly modulated emotional tone. He promised to protect her, a dark irony given he was the primary threat to her existence. We are blindest when staring at what we want. Elena pledged her vows through tears of trauma-induced joy, promising to forgive his shadows. The priest finalized the transaction. Alessandro kissed her with a consuming hunger, pulling the air from her lungs. But let us look at the external reality, you and I. Psychopathy does not exist in a vacuum. While Elena played the bride, the criminal underworld mobilized. A rival syndicate humiliated by a previous conflict was actively plotting their retaliation. The morning after the ceremony, his lieutenant advised delaying the honeymoon due to the escalating threat. Alessandro's features hardened into absolute stone, refusing the counsel. The honeymoon phase was already ending. The monster was awake, and the real violence was just beginning. The subject, Alessandro, presents classic markers of a megalomaniac narcissist. He justifies his violence by projecting his needs onto his captive partner. His fingers stroked his platinum wedding band, a physical symbol of his coercive control over Elena. He commanded his subordinate, Marco, to delay retaliating against the rival Benedetti faction until he returned. Any opposition, he declared, would be met with lethal force. Let us examine this closely. He isolates her in a remote villa in Amalfi, high above the crashing waves. Elena stood on the balcony, mistaking her complete isolation for peace. When he wrapped his arms around her, it was not an embrace. It was a warden securing his prized possession. When he whispered into her hair to ask what she was thinking, her response revealed the profound depth of her trauma bond. She confessed her fear of escaping, her fear of never returning to her captor, Turning to face him in the fading light, she did not see a violent predator. She saw a damaged protector. She examined his tattoos, marking his neck like literal declarations of war, and rationalized his lethal capabilities as strength. She told him she loved him. We see this often in prolonged captivity. The victim offers affection as a survival mechanism, feeling each declaration is a profound gift. When he pressed his forehead to hers, affirming his possession, she pulled him deeper into their shared delusion. As the heavy door closed, darkness swallowed the room. What followed was a textbook honeymoon phase, lasting exactly 3 days. This is the period of the abuse cycle, where the megalomaniac narcissist fabricates a flawless reality. For 3 days, Elena awoke to the rhythmic crashing of the sea against the cliffs. Feeling his hands trace her skin under the morning sun, they shared meals on secluded terraces, drinking wine and role-playing as ordinary lovers. The clinical reality is chilling. Alessandro appeared to shed his chronic hypervigilance. The tension melted from his shoulders in the salt air. He laughed at her attempts at humor. But this relaxation was merely a temporary suspension of his psychopathy. The pathology deepened as he permitted her to lead him through ordinary tourist shops. Buying meaningless souvenirs, he was wearing the mask of humanity. On the third evening, curled against his chest under the stars, Elena whispered that they should stay forever. Notice how he responds. The narcissist immediately offers an absolute, grandiose sacrifice. He claimed he would abandon his entire criminal empire for her. The moonlight illuminated the ink on his neck. Family, honor, blood. She doubted his terrifying sincerity, but he insisted it was true. You and I must understand something critical here. He does not mean he will choose her over violence. He means she has become the very center of his violent universe. He claimed his power meant nothing without her, insisting she was the only thing that filled his chronic emptiness. This is classic mirroring, designed to make the victim feel utterly responsible for his emotional stability. Elena experienced acute cognitive dissonance. She wanted desperately to believe him, but the psychological wounds from months of psychological torture still throbbed. She could not easily repress the memory of him murmuring her dead sister's name in his sleep. The crippling realization that she was merely a substitute for his true obsession lingered. Scars of this nature do not simply fade. Unable to process the manipulation, she whispered for them to go inside, retreating into the physical safety of the villa. The illusion shattered the moment his phone rang. The physical transformation was immediate and absolute. His jaw locked, and the affectionate husband was instantly replaced by the apex predator. She watched him experience a brief, agonizing internal conflict. He sat her down and answered the call from his lieutenant, Marco. Observe how quickly his emotional affect flattens when confronted with a threat. The color drained from his face, and his vocal tone dropped into a cold, flat register of pure calculation. He demanded a casualty count and issued orders to hold all movement until his arrival in 6 hours. When he ended the call and passed back to her, Elena was staring at a complete stranger. The mask had slipped entirely. The man she loved was gone, replaced by the ruthless cartel leader she had spent three years learning to survive. He informed her coldly that the Benedetti faction had struck one of his facilities, leaving 12 men dead. But the true psychological trigger was the message they left behind. He revealed that her name had been written in blood on the warehouse wall. The psychological ground fell out from under Elena. The rival syndicate was attempting to induce a state of emotional dysregulation in Alessandro. They understood his pathology. They knew Elena was his singular fixation, his most glaring vulnerability. They were gambling that his megalomania would fracture under the threat to his property. He took her face in his hands. His thumbs pressed into her cheekbones as he made a series of chilling declarations. He promised to burn the rival organization to the ground and hunt down every individual involved. He swore he would not let his emotions cause a tactical error. The most disturbing clinical detail is not his vow of mass murder, but Elena's reaction to it. She believed him implicitly. Her Stockholm syndrome was so absolute that his promise of slaughter provided her with a profound sense of comfort. They evacuated to Rome before dawn. Upon their return, the estate had become a fortified compound. Armed guards swarmed the perimeter. As the heavy steel gates locked behind them, Elena felt the familiar, suffocating weight of her psychological cage. Alessandro attempted to reframe her captivity as protection, assuring her that nothing could breach his perimeter without his explicit consent. But the human mind cannot easily differentiate between a fortress and a prison. In his private study, the air was thick with clinical paranoia. Marco stood over a desk buried in tactical maps and surveillance imagery. This was the true state of Alessandro's mind, a chaotic web of violence spreading like a pathogen. Marco delivered his intelligence report. The Benedetti Group had ceased all visible operations. Their leadership had vanished into the underground. This absence of data indicated a behavioral escalation. They were preparing a catastrophic strike, likely related to the bloody message. Marco hypothesized that the bloody message was designed to trigger Alessandro's impulsivity. Alessandro's response was a textbook display of narcissistic control. He squeezed Elena's hand, a physical reminder of his ownership, and declared he would deny them that satisfaction. His mandate was absolute. They would project an image of invulnerability, and his wife would not leave the compound under any circumstances. When Elena's spine stiffened, demanding to know if she had a voice in her own confinement, both men stared at her. Alessandro coldly explained that she was merely a target to be used against him. He needed her secured in a controlled environment. When she accused him of making her a prisoner, the psychological tension spiked. He displayed a brief micro-expression of hurt before his sociopathic detachment returned. He insisted his authoritarian measures were simply an effort to preserve her life. Elena's counter-argument is fascinating from a behavioral. She softened her vocal tone, instinctively pacifying her captor before outlining her demands. She refused to regress into the invisible, compliant victim she had been for 3 years. She demanded active participation in his violent enterprise. She reminded him that she had spent years observing his methods, absorbing the brutal mechanics of his criminal empire. She stared directly into the eyes of a known killer and refused to be shelved like a fragile object while a gang war raged around her. He subjected her to a rigorous visual assessment, dissecting her psychological state. He was scanning for structural weaknesses, for any trace of hesitation he could exploit to force her compliance. He found a rigidly integrated defense mechanism instead. Finally, he ordered Marco to grant her full security clearance regarding the rival threat. Marco's visible reluctance highlighted the deeply ingrained misogyny of their social structure, but he obeyed. Alessandro established the rigid parameters of her new reality: total physical confinement to the estate, but total cognitive access to the war room. It was not genuine freedom, it was a slight expansion of her cage, an illusion of an equal partnership, but for Elena it was a victory. In the exhausting days that followed, Elena exhibited an extreme trauma response known as hyperfixation. She entirely submerged her identity into the mechanics of the syndicate war. She memorized territorial boundaries and the shifting loyalties of violent men. Through this obsessive study, she began to profile their unseen enemy. The Benedetti Syndicate was suffering from an organizational necrosis. Their patriarch, Enzo, was dying of terminal cancer. This biological reality had forced his son, Luca, into a premature leadership role. Let us analyze Luca for a moment. He was displaying classic signs of an inferiority complex, driven by a frantic need to validate his existence before the death of his dominant father figure. Elena correctly diagnosed the rival heir's motivation during a late-night intelligence briefing. She realized Luca was not motivated by strategic expansion, but by a pathological need for historical significance. He wanted to be immortalized as the man who destroyed the Vitali Empire. Marco validated her psychological profile. The warehouse massacre was an act of pure theatricality. Elena's cognitive assimilation into Alessandro's world was now complete. She advised her husband to abandon defensive posturing and initiate a preemptive strike. She was urging a psychopath to commit violence. It is a harsh but simple truth of human nature, you see. If you spend enough time surviving in the dark, your own eyes eventually forget the light. Let us examine the triangulation of familial bonds in this case. The target is Giulia Benedetti. She remains insulated from the bloodshed, yet Luca fixates on her as his sole psychological anchor. Marco, the enforcer, exhibits cognitive dissonance, disturbed by the suggestion of engaging a civilian. But Elena offers a masterful behavioral pivot. She proposes an invitation, an extraction of vulnerability. You and I must recognize the brilliance here. She understands that psychological warfare always transcends physical trauma. By manipulating Luca's attachment, projecting a threat toward his sister, she forces a paranoid decompensation. He will overplay his hand to protect his blood. The room falls silent. Then, Alessandro's reaction breaks the tension, a genuine vocalization of amusement completely devoid of his usual manufactured charm. Alessandro's response demonstrates the behavior of a megalomaniac narcissist is encountering intellectual parity. He notes with delight that Elena has outmaneuvered both apex predators in the room. Marco rigidly agrees to coordinate a public exposure event with Giulia. Elena experiences an acute nervous system response when she realizes she must execute the operation. Alessandro validates her logic, noting a female emissary bypasses the typical threat receptors of a paranoid system. His demeanor then shifts to possessive hypervigilance. He approaches her, physically reflames. His hands anchor her waist in a display of territorial ownership and pathological attachment, warning her to abort at the first sign of danger, promising his extraction team will be waiting. Let us observe this fascinating power exchange. Elena challenges his protective instincts, elevating herself from a liability to an active enabler. She demands to be his strength. Alessandro's megalomania softens into a rare admission of his own perceptual blindness. The preparation phase over the next 3 days is a textbook study in behavioral conditioning. Elena rehearses every conceivable social variable, mapping escape routes while Marco drills her on crisis protocols. They rigorously program her to suppress natural flight responses. You and I must recognize that this is how survival often masquerades as love in the criminal mind. She embraces the tactical anxiety, actively rewiring her brain to operate as the perfect extension of her husband's controlling will. The night before the operation, Alessandro manifests visible distress. His baseline narcissism fractures under the weight of his attachment. As they lie together, his fingers trace repetitive patterns against her skin, a subconscious mechanism to manage his paranoia. He searches for a safe alternative, a striking deviation from his profile. Elena, however, exhibits profound rationalization. She mirrors his affection to de-escalate his panic, arguing that confronting the threat is the only path to safety. Her desire to contribute highlights a complex psychological adaptation. She is internalizing the organization's aggressive methodology, mistaking her dangerous immersion in this violently unstable reality for a manifestation of genuine empowerment and control over her own destiny. His midnight confession of affection serves as a psychological anchor, binding her loyalty when she is most at risk. Their insomnia is a mutual trauma response, a severe hyperarousal of the nervous system. The tactical staging begins at an isolated Roman cafe. Elena arrives early to secure a defensible perimeter. Observe her physiological reality. Her heart races, yet she masks it with controlled motor functions while ordering her coffee, relying on clinical compartmentalization. Marco's unseen surveillance team operates as a security blanket, satisfying the paranoia of her husband's empire. Meanwhile, Alessandro waits blocks away, his megalomania demanding he remain the absolute arbiter of her physical survival if this behavioral experiment unexpectedly fractures. The subject, Giulia Benedetti, enters the environment exhibiting predictable prey behaviors. Her rigid posture and hypervigilant eye movements indicate chronic stress, a byproduct of her violent familial paradigm. When she addresses Elena, we observe a fascinating clash of two traumatized systems. Elena utilizes precise de-escalation tactics, offering a seat to lower the perceived threat. Giulia's immediate reference to her brother's potential rage highlights a deep trauma bond. She filters every independent decision through the lens of Luca's volatile emotional regulation. Elena masterfully counters this by establishing a shared objective, bypassing the immediate threat response. By proposing that they desire the exact same outcome, Elena carefully begins to dismantle Giulia's defensive psychological architecture. Elena diagnoses the core pathology of the rival syndicate perfectly. She articulates Giulia's suppressed fear, Luca's impending psychological collapse once his father dies and his emotional regulators vanish. Giulia's micro-expressions of guarded hope reveal that Elena has bypassed her cognitive defenses. Giulia tries to project Luca's narcissism as an unstoppable force. You and I must pay attention to this clinical maneuver. Elena validates Giulia's reality by weaponizing her own. She admits the inherent danger of her husband, leveraging her personal trauma bond to forge an empathetic connection. She frames their codependence on violent, wounded men not as a weakness, but as a shared psychological burden, successfully establishing a therapeutic alliance in the middle of a conflict zone. Elena employs a sophisticated cognitive reframing technique. She shatters the delusion of their lifestyle, clinically admitting her husband's sociopathy, while introducing the concept of behavioral rehabilitation. By suggesting her husband is reforming, she projects a model of recovery onto Luca. She assigns Giulia the role of the regulatory influence, playing into the savior complex common in trauma bond victims. She tasks her with preventing her brother's psychological decompensation. When Elena proposes a neutral environment devoid of aggressive stimuli, Giulia's rejection is a conditioned reflex. She cannot conceptualize Luca functioning outside of a heavily armed context. The mere idea of equitable dialogue violently threatens the rigid parameters of his pathology. Notice the physical bridge Elena builds, reaching across without forcing contact. It is a calculated boundary negotiation, respecting Julia's hypervigilance while projecting empathy. Elena places the locus of control onto Julia, feeding her the illusion of agency. The extended silence is the sound of cognitive dissonance resolving. Julia's tentative agreement marks the installation of a new psychological directive. We observe two characters of megalomaniac, narcissist navigating the traumatized space between their violent environments. A fragile trust emerges from their shared pathology. Once the subject departs, Elena seamlessly shifts from empathetic mirror back to tactical operative, signaling her unseen handlers to initiate the extraction protocol. The controlled environment shatters with catastrophic suddenness. The ambush is executed with predatory precision, bypassing Elena's trained sensory sweeps. Her physical containment is absolute before her amygdala can process the threat. Then the antagonist manifests. Luca's entrance is steeped in the theatricality typical of the sociopathic spectrum. His triumphant smile is a display of narcissistic supply, feeding off her acute vulnerability. He dismantles her safety net, mocking the surveillance she believed was impenetrable. He calmly reveals that her husband's operatives have been redirected by a manufactured decoy. Luca has isolated the subject, systematically stripping away her protection and plunging her into a state of profound psychological shock. Luca's motivation reveals the architecture of a fatal obsession. He intends to psychologically deconstruct his rival. By using Elena as a behavioral trigger, Luca guarantees Alessandro's megalomania will override his tactical logic. He weaponizes their trauma bond into a predictable vulnerability. As the extraction begins, observe Elena's conditioned resilience. She suppresses panic, rapidly scanning for programmed contingencies. But Luca's pathology is meticulous. He anticipates her countermeasures, confirming the complete electronic isolation of the perimeter. He systematically removes all external variables, ensuring her survival now depends entirely on primitive autonomic responses as she is violently dragged toward the waiting transport in the dark alley. At this critical juncture, the subject's baseline conditioning takes over. Faced with the transport vehicle, Elena's fight-or-flight response violently engages. She exploits a momentary sensory overload in her captor, deploying her concealed weapon with feral efficiency. The resulting physical trauma fractures the group's formation. You and I can see how Luca immediately asserts dominance over the chaos, demanding she remain a living asset for his psychological warfare. Elena's subsequent sprint is pure adrenal expenditure. Our terror drives her blindly through the urban labyrinth until the geography betrays her. The dead end forces a final confrontation. Cornered and hyperventilating, she elevates the blade, adopting a terminal defensive posture against an overwhelming predatory force. Luca's clinical detachment toward her resistance is chilling. He evaluates her violence as an impressive data point, validating her utility as a pawn. He intends to utilize her physical degradation to entirely shatter Alessandro's emotional regulation. By projecting the image of a broken wife, Luca plans to induce severe cognitive impairment in his rival, forcing errors born of desperate attachment. Elena's defensive perimeter collapses under sheer numbers. Her motor functions are forcefully neutralized. The weapon disarmed. Her shout is a primitive refusal of subjugation. But just as the psychological darkness threatens to become absolute, The sudden acoustic shockwave of a ballistic discharge violently disrupts the neurological processing of everyone in the confined alleyway. The manifestation of Alessandro is a study in apex predatory behavior. His hypervigilance led him directly to his anchor. His enforcers flood the space with overwhelming threat. Alessandro's vocal control is perfectly quiet, devoid of aggressive markers, indicating a man who has fully integrated his homicidal ideation. Luca's confidence immediately fractures. His threat to execute Elena is a desperate attempt to reassert a crumbling power dynamic. Alessandro refuses to negotiate, maintaining a visual lock that asserts absolute dominance. Let us take away this final lesson. True terror is profoundly contagious. The violent tremor, transferring from the captor to Elena's skin, proves that even hardened criminals instinctively recognize when they are standing before a pure, unregulated monster. Let us open this case file together. We begin with a classic display of the megalomaniacal narcissist reacting to a perceived theft of his property. Luca Benedetti, foolishly attempting to reason with Alessandro, claimed the kingpin could not protect Elena forever, but Alessandro did not exhibit anger. As a behavioral analyst, I look for rage, yet his face showed pure, absolute emptiness, the psychopath's void. He moved with predatory speed, expressing his dominance. In an instant, Luca was on the ground, Alessandro's foot crushing his throat, a weapon pressed between his eyes. The lesson here is grim but true. You cannot negotiate with a predator whose only currency is absolute control. Notice the physiological response of the subject, Elena, as she is released. She stumbles against the alley wall, her central nervous system overwhelmed by severe trauma. Her bodyguard checks for injuries, but the true damage is psychological. Before her lies Luca Benedetti, terminated by a single clinical shot to the cranium. Standing over the corpse is Alessandro, his pulse likely resting at a cool 60 beats per minute. The blood on his knuckles is merely a biological byproduct of his dominance. Elena looks at her husband and experiences acute cognitive dissonance. The gentle illusion he constructed for her at night has shattered, revealing the calculating apex predator beneath. In my years profiling offenders in maximum security, I rarely see the mask slip so completely. To Elena, the monster was suddenly undeniable. Alessandro commanded his men to remove her from the scene, his tone utterly devoid of emotional resonance. He was compartmentalizing, preparing to systematically eradicate the entire Benedetti bloodline to protect his prized possession. As she was led away, Elena cast one final glance back at the man she married. She watched him descend willingly into profound violence. We often blind ourselves to the darkness in those we love, hoping our affection can cure their pathology, but a scorpion will always sting. It is simply their nature. The aftermath of such a psychotic break leaves the environment saturated with hypervigilance. Elena lay awake all night, processing the sensory data of a criminal empire at war. When Alessandro finally returned at dawn, his physical presentation was staggering, completely coated in arterial spray, his energy depleted. He announced the eradication of his rivals as a twisted gesture of devotion. Yet, observe his sudden hesitation in the doorway. Even a megalomaniacal narcissist requires validation from their chosen mirror. He stood frozen, experiencing a rare flash of genuine paranoia. He feared his ultimate act of possession had irreparably broken the very object he sought to keep. She asked him for the body count, a desperate attempt to quantify the trauma. His response was a single, chilling word enough. Elena was forced to confront the reality of her marital contract. Knowing a man is a killer conceptually is vastly different from smelling the copper on his skin. I find it fascinating how the power dynamic shifted in this singular moment. She commanded him to approach, and the apex predator crossed the room like a cautious animal. He offered a superficial apology, not for the mass execution, but merely for her having to witness it. But here we see the trap closing. She tells him not to apologize for his violence, fully stepping into his distorted reality. You and I must examine the psychological phenomenon unfolding in this bedroom. Elena's declaration of love in the face of absolute horror is a textbook manifestation of trauma bonding, deeply intertwined with Stockholm Syndrome. She rationalizes his monstrous behavior by framing it as a protective mechanism for her benefit. The victim finds safety by aligning with the most dangerous entity in the room. When he collapses into her arms, shaking with repressed terror at the thought of losing his possession, he confesses he would have burned the city to ash for her. She soothes the executioner. We learn here that trauma does not repel, love it perversely binds it stronger than steel. She provides tactile comfort to a mass murderer, stroking his hair, her own survival instincts thoroughly bypassed. She openly questions her lack of fear, a clear symptom of her conditioned mind. Her reasoning, because I am yours, and you are mine, is the ultimate submission to a megalomaniac's framework of ownership. They are enmeshed in a shared psychosis. He kisses her, blending the taste of fresh carnage with obsessive devotion. When he admits he does not deserve her, he is displaying a fleeting moment of self-awareness. Yet, she anchors him, accepting the blood debt. True captivity is not physical. The strongest prisons are built entirely inside the unprotected human mind. As the diurnal cycle reset, the psychological normalization of deviance began. The blood was scrubbed away, but the psychic stains remained permanent. They were simply two severely damaged profiles, reinforcing each other's pathologies in the morning light. In the ensuing months, the violent vacuum left by the Benedetti family's decimation stabilized. The rival patriarchs succumbed to grief, his network disintegrating. Alessandro then initiated the final phase of Elena's integration. He exposed every illicit operation to her, demanding her complicity. By sharing the architecture of his empire, he ensured she could never claim innocence again. She was no longer a bystander to the crime. Her transition from civilian to active participant in a criminal enterprise was methodical. She began offering tactical opinions, cementing her role in his antisocial ecosystem. His lieutenant, Marco, mistakenly diagnosed this as Elena changing the kingpin's fundamental nature. But personality disorders do not cure themselves. Elena correctly deduced that Alessandro had merely found an environment where his specific brand of control was celebrated. Her sister Valentina observed this transformation during their supervised visits. They tacitly agreed to ignore the corpses beneath the floorboards. Valentina noted Elena looked happy, failing to recognize the profound numbness required to survive. Elena's self-reported happiness is a fascinating clinical endpoint. It requires a total suppression of moral anxiety. She had ceased anticipating betrayal or violence, fully adapting to the chronic stress of her environment. In psychological terms, her baseline for normalcy had been permanently altered. She no longer felt like a mere substitute, but rather a vital cog in his narcissistic machinery. Exactly 1 year later, the kingpin transported her to the geographic origin of their union. Sitting on an Amalfi balcony, watching the sunset, his thumb traced her wedding band, a constant physical reminder of his ownership. Peace, for them, was simply the temporary absence of active warfare. The introduction of offspring into a volatile, psychological dynamic alters all established variables. When Elena announced her 12-week pregnancy, the Kingpin experienced a system override. His cognitive processing cycled rapidly through shock and disbelief before landing on a profound, terrifying awe. He held her with extreme physical caution, acutely aware of his own destructive capabilities. Then came the tears, a silent, autonomic release of tension from a man who dictates life and death for thousands. He confessed he never believed he would achieve a functional family unit. It is a stark reminder that even the most damaged, dangerous minds harbor a desperate yearning for connection. Let us look closely at how the megalomaniac frames his new reality. He genuinely believed normal familial bonds were reserved for a different species of human, people devoid of his inherent darkness. Elena, fully entrenched in her trauma bond, validated him, insisting he deserved absolute devotion. His laughter, in that moment, was an explosive release of lifelong pathological shame. Touching her abdomen, he immediately transitioned back into the role of the apex protector. He made a vow to shield their unborn child from the very psychological rot that created him. It is the eternal, tragic paradox of the violent parent using bloodshed to carve out a sterile, safe space for their progeny. He promised his child would never experience the emotional deprivation that forged his own sociopathy. Looking at him, Elena finally saw the complete psychological profile, a man fundamentally flawed, exceptionally dangerous, yet capable of an intense, almost suffocating tenderness. He thanked her for her endurance, for peering through the monstrous facade and choosing to stay. This is the ultimate victory for a narcissist. Absolute, unconditional acceptance of their darkest self. When their daughter was born, they named her Sophia, an homage to the mother he lost. They were attempting to rewrite their genetic legacy, hoping the profound trauma of the past would not infect the future generation. In the delivery room, the feared cartel leader was reduced to a terrified, weeping biological organism. Holding his fragile infant, his primary fear was his own potential to cause harm, a rare and significant flash of true insight. He worried his inherent violence would somehow transfer to the child. Elena reassured him, noting he had approached parenting with the same obsessive, calculating strategy he applied to criminal warfare. She believed his capacity for fierce, possessive love would override his monstrous tendencies. Only time reveals if a predator can truly be domesticated. The life lesson remains unresolved. We cannot wash away our shadows. We can only teach our children not to fear the dark. Open the file to the maternity ward. Alessandro, a documented megalomaniacal narcissist, displays what mimics standard paternal affection. His eyes tear up. He says, "I love you." But you and I need to dissect the pathology here. This is not just the normal vulnerability of new parenthood. For a kingpin, this is the acquisition of a new emotional asset. The infant, Sophia, demands her first feeding. Alessandro hovers relentlessly at Elena's shoulder, adjusting pillows, fetching water. To the civilian eye, he is a devoted partner, doing everything he can. Clinically speaking, it is pure environmental control. Elena, deeply entrenched in Stockholm Syndrome, misinterprets his suffocating presence as profound safety. By sunrise, she whispers, "We did it. The trauma bond is now biological." He kisses her forehead, claiming they built something beautiful. Look at Elena's cognitive distortion. Here she gazes at a violent kingpin and believes the monster became a man solely for her sake. This is the classic rationalization of the captive mind. As the years pass in a blur of domestic chaos, Sophia grows into a fiercely assertive little girl. we witness a fascinating behavioral paradox in Alessandro. The tyrant who governed an underworld empire with an iron fist turns to jelly at a single please from his daughter. When Elena warns that the child will destroy him over a mock tea party, he remains entirely unbothered. The megalomaniac hasn't lost his ego. He has simply transferred his grandiosity onto his offspring, viewing his submission to her as proof of his own redemption. Yet, the criminal empire continued to breathe. Alessandro simply delegated the heavy lifting, stepping back from the shadow world to play the devoted family man. His neck tattoos remained a permanent psychological barcode of his true nature, even as Elena convinced herself he was now defined by fatherhood. She genuinely believed he learned that power meant nothing without love, a romanticized read of a sociopathic shift in strategy. His subordinate, Marco, absorbed the daily operational risks as a new partner. The syndicate evolved beneath this shared leadership. It remained highly dangerous, but it adopted a more surgical, selective approach to its violence. The underlying beast was never actually cured. It merely learned how to hunt quietly so it wouldn't disturb the perfect illusion at home. Elena never acclimated to the violence. Instead, her Stockholm syndrome forced an adaptation. She compartmentalized the bloodshed as an unchangeable quirk of her captor, negotiating peace with his darkness simply to survive. For their 5th anniversary, Alessandro orchestrated a calculated piece of emotional manipulation. He brought her back to Florence, to a room that framed the exact view from her most isolated moments of past escape. When she asked why, he framed the location as a monument to his own near loss, claiming it was where he realized what he had nearly destroyed. Clinically, he was overwriting her geography of trauma. By pulling her close against the glittering river, he systematically replaced her sole memory of independence with a permanent monument to his psychological control. He claimed he wanted to reclaim the city, making it theirs instead of hers. Notice the language of colonization. The narcissist cannot tolerate a sanctuary that excludes him. She called him a romantic, blind to this possessive erasure. Walking the streets she once paced in terror, her internal narrative shifted completely. She no longer felt like a fugitive. She believed she belonged there. This is the captor's ultimate victory, when the victim embraces the cage as home. Her sister Valentina joined them for dinner, offering a stark portrait of actual independence. While they laughed over fading scars, Valentina noticed Alessandro was still secretly terrified of her. She correctly diagnosed that the kingpin simply feared the undeniable autonomy Valentina represented. Valentina suggested she represented a life he almost chose. The women smiled, relieved the kingpin made the right choice. They frame his decisions not ruin them as a moral triumph, rather than a calculated pivot. Alessandro's hand immediately secured Elena's beneath the table, a subtle physical tether. The psychological play resumed. Later, on a private terrace, Florence spread out like a conquered jewel box. He produced a velvet case. Elena noted she had a ring, but he revealed a delicate diamond pendant on a platinum chain. You and I must understand, jewelry is never simply an accessory in these behavioral profiles. It is a beautifully crafted collar, disguised as spun moonlight, engineered to rest permanently against the compliant victim's throat. She called the piece beautiful. Hey. He immediately deployed a trauma bonding narrative, revealing it was the sole item saved from his mother after his father destroyed their lives. By weaponizing his childhood trauma, the narcissist manufactured instant emotional gravity. He fastened it around her neck, declaring her his ultimate legacy, the only thing he built that mattered. Notice the clinical phrasing. She is no longer an independent human. She is his engineered creation. She professed her love. His response was chillingly assured, "I know." The megalomaniac expects this mirrored adoration. She then claimed she never regretted her choice, successfully repressing the agonizing memories of his past betrayals, the severe psychological doubt, and the deeply shattered reality she had only barely survived. She confirmed her lack of regret, rationalizing their trauma as a necessary crucible. You and I can clearly see the post hoc justification here, the captive mind's desperate attempt to assign meaning to senseless suffering, to prevent psychological collapse. He kissed her above the glittering city, sealing the rewritten narrative. She felt absolute certainty she belonged in a life built from the ashes of her own pain. As the case file progresses, we observe them aging. They characterized their highly volatile dynamic as true love, fighting and forgiving in a cyclic repetition of their original trauma bond. They expanded their insular universe, raising children, effectively passing down this romanticized codependency to an entirely new generation. Eventually, the syndicate transitioned to their son, laundering the brutal legacy into near legitimacy. The overt violence faded, but the power remained. The couple stayed perpetually entangled, their daily arguments as a domesticated veneer over a deep foundation of control. One evening, his faded ink marking his violent origins, the kingpin confessed he never expected this peaceful end. Elena, curled against him in submission, agreed. The life lesson here is chillingly stark. We must never confuse the surrender of our autonomy with the presence of true love. He kissed her forehead with a reverence maintained for 40 years, whispering his thanks. Make no mistake, he wasn't thanking her for her enduring love. He was thanking her for a lifetime of unbroken compliance. When she asked what he was thankful for, he cited her staying and giving him a life worth living. This is ultimate narcissistic absorption. Her existence is validated solely by its utility to his redemption arc. She smiled, praising his bravery to earn it, validating the false narrative that a captor's basic humanity is a heroic achievement. Outside, dawn broke, marking the thousands of days their trauma bond had sustained itself. The record claims their story ended quietly, masquerading as a beautiful romance where two partners chose each other daily. But you and I must remember the clinical baseline of how this truly began. She had originally fled from him in absolute terror, her psychological reality completely shattered by his inherent, unapologetic deceit. The narrative insists he chased her through a personal transformation to become worthy of her return. We recognize this as a dangerous romanticization of coercive control. The file claims they built something deeper than obsession, a love that conquered every shadow, insisting it was undeniably real, always together. As we close this case file, the clinical truth remains uncomfortably clear. What they built was never a healthy romance. It was a perfectly sealed feedback loop of shared pathology. The megalomaniac found his unquestioning mirror, and the captive found permanent comfort inside the cage. This relationship endured for decades, not because it was the ultimate love story, but because a mutually reinforced trauma bond is simply the hardest psychological prison to ever escape. One of the most important lessons from Elena's story is that love cannot survive on affection alone if honesty is missing. For 3 years, Elena believes she is building a life with Alessandro Vitali. She gives him her loyalty, her tenderness, and her whole heart. Yet one whispered name in the darkness reveals a painful truth. Part of his past has never been fully resolved. The tragedy is not only that Alessandro once loved Valentina, but that Elena was never given the complete truth. She lived inside a relationship where silence protected him but wounded her. This teaches a meaningful educational lesson. Secrets do not disappear simply because they are not spoken. They grow quietly beneath the surface until one day they break trust in a much more painful way. Alessandro may not have intended to hurt Elena, but his refusal to confront his past allowed her to feel like a replacement rather than a chosen partner. In real relationships, people often hide difficult truths because they fear conflict, shame, or loss. However, hiding the truth usually creates deeper damage later. Elena's pain shows that love needs emotional transparency. A partner deserves to know whether they are loved for who they are, not because they resemble someone else or fill an old emptiness. The story also teaches that honesty should come early, not only after someone has been hurt. If Alessandro had spoken honestly about Valentina, his guilt, and his confusion, Elena might have suffered less. The educational message is clear. Love becomes strong when both people are brave enough to speak the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. A relationship built on silence may look peaceful, but real peace requires honesty.